Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and again, I am joined by a special guest, Dr. Jason Brinkley.
Hi, how are you? It's great to be here.
Tell us about yourself.
So, I am a data scientist by day, and I work for a corporation that does a lot of government research. And when I'm not doing that, I have several hobbies, including playing Magic. I have a PhD in statistics, and I'm a pretty big math nerd.
About how long have you been playing Magic for, Jason, give or takes?
Oh, I started in Revised, and so I've been playing for a very long time. I took a little bit of break through some parts in college, but, I got back into it a few years ago when I found a great play group to play with.
Yeah, so I wanted to lead off something interesting here. A little history here, and it'll correlate to what we're going to talk about during this particular episode. So, Marion Tinsley, the greatest checker player of all time, for 40 years, Mr. Tinsley was never defeated. He lost a few little miniature subsets, but never lost a match. He was known to be the best in the world until, in 1992, he was beaten by a machine called Chinook. And it's literally the first program that just destroyed that game. It's now known the perfect plays. You can't do world championship checker games anymore without the perfect play on the board. And it kind of coordinates what we're talking about in this particular episode, which is going to be magical math. And the reason why I introduced Dr. Brinkley, a real PhD.
Real PhD.
A real one. He's got all the P's.
Uh-huh. My mom tells people that I'm a doctor, but not like a medical doctor. So.
Yeah, he's the kind of doctor, if you're on the airplane and you need help, do not call for him because he'll just start doing math on your heart. So we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our libations of the show. And in this particular episode, we're enjoying, my homebrew. It's going to be my Uber Ale. It's going to be a raspberry jalapeno pale ale. And I've had this sucker sitting in the secondary in the bottles for about 15 days, and it's going to crack. Here we go. Woo! Hear that, carbs. Yeah. That's good stuff. That's the
wow.
Is that a wow? Did I get a wow?
Wow.
Did I get a wow? We're taking this to CubeCon. All right, here's that, folks.
You're taking this to CubeCon?
I am. You don't get no more.
Oh, wow.
He's not coming to CubeCon. Yeah, let's give this a whirl. I got to wow this a little bit. Yeah, that's a wow.
Wow.
That's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
All right. So our topic is going to be magical math. And instead of me leading this off as I traditionally do, I'm going to ask Dr. Brinkley to kind of carry this first subsection here, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Sure thing. So there was a previous episode that you all did talking about math and poker. And I think that really provides a good starting point, right? There was a lot of great comparisons there. There was a lot of discussion about playing the players, looking for tails, things like that. But, poker also has a tremendous amount of math, right? And so sort of leading off of what you were saying about the checkers piece, there's been a lot of focus on math in poker because recently I attended a talk by a Liv Bowery, who was a professional poker player and astrophysicist. And she was talking about the idea that AI has really taken over on something like poker. And so it's really causing a real downward trend in like online Texas Hold'em. Now you don't know whether or not you're playing people or if you're playing the algorithms or something like that. Those algorithms are all built on math. So it kind of leads you to the idea that like, how much math is there in Magic? If it is all math, then ideally it can be broken like checkers. It can be broken like poker's getting broken. So then the question then sort of becomes like, well, how much math is there in Magic?
How many variations? How many permutations?
Yeah.
What's the standard deviation that you're dealing with? There's a lot involved in this, and we're going to cover all of that. So I'm going to take a different stance. So we've got a data scientist versus a controls engineer, and that's what we're going to do today. It's going to be 1v1. Ding, 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 ding. Here we go. All right. So UberBear versus Dr. Brinkley. So I'm all about, and I have stated it before, I'm all about the gut. Being ex-military, I believe in the gut. It's not about the aircraft. It's about the pilot. Top Gun, one of the greatest films of all time, but it does hold true. I do believe that the gut can take over. I mean, before we even go down this, literally Luke would have never blown up the Death Star if he used the machine. I just want to point it out. Spoiler alert. We're just going to pause and make him ruminate on that one. Dr. Brinkley is staring into the abyss. All right. So In order to do this, we're going to kind of set the tone so we can talk about variance and attrition, because that's kind of what this game's going to be on, and how we can apply mathematical functions to this idea, right? Yeah. And that's why I brought the IE data scientist into the field. So we're going to talk about my environments in particular so that he can have points of references. I've got a 540 powered. Those will be referenced. A 360 horror, a 360 La Femme Fatale, a 482 headed giant, a 360 artifact cube, and 180 Munson Lord of Metal cube that has 3 tiers of pie. So Dr. Brinkley is going to carry over this next piece.
So coming back to poker, right, just briefly, where does the differences start between poker and Magic? So in one instance, everybody's playing with the same 52 cards, right? That's the point of the poker piece, right? You have 52 cards, one deck, everybody's playing. If you're playing Texas Hold'em, everybody's got a board, everybody plays the same board. Magic is way different because everybody's got their own decks. So imagine trying to play poker where each of you had your own 52 card deck and you really didn't know what the other one was doing all the way through, right? And how would you determine the flop?
We call that canasta?
Right? That's exactly what we would call it, right? So there's a lot of differences there. And the idea that, with poker, you just have a fixed number of cards. Whereas in Magic, you're up to over 20,000 unique cards at this point and more being added every day. So, we tend to have different formats in this, but we end up having almost always a card limit, and so those limitations and things that we put around the game sort of make it to where there's a lot of different things that could happen in a lot of different circumstances.
And as we referenced in our discard episode, etc., and when we're talking about play points, us as Magic players, we're trying to break the variance, we're trying to break the attrition and overcome the math. But the math is pseudo against us, because we are playing a game of chance, if you will.
Yeah, you just honed in on where I think a lot of the topic of what I'll be talking about today. You said, there is a lot here in terms of chance, but I find that a lot of things in all areas of Magic seem to center around probability. What is the chance that I'm going to get to play this card if I pull it in a draft? What is the chance I'm going to see a particular type of card when I go to draw? What is the chance that my opponent's going to remove this thing that I need to set out? And how difficult is that going to be for them? It's a game based off of a lot of probability. So when you start thinking about things in terms of what is the chance something's going to happen, you're down to nothing but math.
And then I'll play the human aspect versus the machine. You're back to what we talked about in the poker episode. You're reading the tells. You're watching the interactions of the player. You're watching the river, if you will, we talked about in the poker episode. What have they exposed? Information is key to this game. What have they put in the graveyard? What is on the battlefield? What is located in a public zone, even in exile? Now you have knowledge based on the deck, based on reps. And granted, if you're the curator of said cube, you have home field advantage on the initial playouts because every time you introduce a new cube you're the one that built it. You've been staring at it for 3 weeks before they've even got to see it for the first time. So it does really interject a large amount of variance into the first draft experience especially. Would you agree, Dr. Brinkley, i.e. Jason?
I would, but I'd also comment that in the human aspect that you're talking about, like as a cube creator, cube curator, you make assumptions on the lines of play. And I know that most cube curators like to watch their cubes being drafted so they can see what that experience is, see if the lines of play form as expected, as people draft as expected. But what I don't hear the cube curators say enough is what happens when they're drafting and they get to a place and it's like, how did this card wheel 4 times? Why is this card still in here? How come nobody saw the value in that card? Well, guess what, Luke Skywalker? You picked a shot at the Death Star and it whiffed.
Yeah.
And it went all the way around. So
it's like
human
aspect. Like shooting Wharf Rats on Tatooine.
Exactly. But it's when you say the human element in all of this, the human element comes with those human mistakes that impact the math in unexpected ways. So I don't disagree with you on the sort of simple premise that it's not 100% math, but I also take into account that some of the human aspect actually messes up the math in unexpected ways.
Oh yeah, play patterns, play styles, well, 100%. I mean, because we're not machines.
That's right.
We're not Chinook.
Or not. I mean, maybe we are machines. All of these AI algorithms are predicting human behavior. They're showing us so much about ourselves that we thought was in our sort of control that was just sort of a summation of things that have happened to you that leads you to make that choice. Same thing in Magic. Sometimes your lines of play is not just about what you think you're going to do. It's about what your opponents are doing as well. And that interaction back and forth changes those probabilities all the time.
Yeah, the machine's trying to data mine you based on repetition, though. What the human doesn't need is repetition. The human can go out the first time. You can have the best Magic player or the best cube curator or drafter sit down, or hell, one of us on a Friday night, and just play a cube for the very first time with no repetition and not have that machine analytics. All you have is experience. Back to the pilot. Yep. We're going to keep passing it back and forth on pilot versus machine. That may have been what I should have named this episode. But as far as Magic goes, the variants and permutations, we try to break it, but some of us also embrace the chaos, i.e. Christian.
Very much so. I think one of the things specifically about me personally as a Magic player is I've played for so long that I like the unexpected. So in our play group, I'm the one that's most likely to bring out something from Ice Age or something like that. People have to pass the card around the table for everybody to read it.
Yeah, so let's talk about things. So in my 6 cubes, I run a singleton format. I like the challenge and the limited restrictions of designing behind singleton. And I do realize that it has become very popular lately to start running, more fetches and stuff like that. I respect that. But I like the challenge of being... Well, I like the restriction. I like to paint within the lines a little bit and try to find basically new color schemes, right? You give me a black and white paint palette, and I want to make some grays in there too and start making things a little bit more robust than what you were expecting to be able to do with just those simple colors, right? Variation, shades of even, right? So I think restriction is, it's been said before, it grants creativity. Yeah. It does.
Absolutely agree.
So it helps me design. So let's talk about, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Brinkley here in a minute, but let's talk about the MTG versions and how they add and increase variance and probabilities and permutations. And all this is going to be tethered to the idea of cube, but it's good to have a foundation of these ideas and what we're looking at. So in a traditional 60-card format, and this was frankly, this was the least exciting format for me ever. This is where I started playing Magic. It was the 4 ofs. And 4 ofs really do decrease the chance substantially, but also, and if I'm offending anyone, I truly apologize. It's personal opinion. I'm not in love with it. I like the idea of creating something, even if it's not my cube. I'm going to go in and draft Christian's or Chris's cube, or AKA Sandwiches, or soon to be Stu's cube, etc. Or Jason didn't even mention he has a cool kids cube, but we'll talk about that on a later episode with 2 Ks. K for cool, K for kids. But going in for the first time, it challenges me as a person. So I don't need restrictions. I don't like having the 60-card 4 ofs. I do realize people like that, but it personally falls into a repetition for me, which I think a machine would very much love.
Well, absolutely. The machines would absolutely love. As a Magic player, a longtime Magic player, I too am really kind of fed up and done with the traditional 60-card format. It was not very innovative. I mean, I played it in high school, and it's one of the reasons why I kind of quit, was that it was getting somewhat boring and repetitive. You'd lose to people setting up, certain win combos, and it wasn't really about play. It was just about who can get to their win condition first.
They had basically used Chinook to pre-designate, because we have the Internet of Things now, right? And so all of these decks that you see have been designed by professional players. They become replicated in all these other formats. And they almost become straight lines at a certain point. And they take away the thing that I love about this, and again, the cube curation and the singleton, is the permutations. I love the variation. I like the variance.
I want to foreshadow something there later on, because I totally agree with this Chinook concept, but I actually think that this is something that's starting to hurt cubes. You all, we've talked a little bit, I've heard you all talk a little bit on the Cube Cobra. And so we should foreshadow this discussion for a little bit, because the notion that people take a pro or a big sort of great build and they replicate it, and that hurts the game overall, I think it's actually coming to cubes, because so many people start with somebody else's cube and then modify it for themselves. And we're kind of falling into the same trap there.
Yeah, the MTGO in particular, it's considered the monolith of cube. And it took me as a curator to gain a level of maturity in my curation to break away from what other people thought. Meaning my archetypes used to almost be lockstep with either AKA Chris Moore Sandwich, right? He had a beautifully curated 540, but I was almost replicating his steps. Yep. I wasn't using any of my, and actually I didn't love it because of that. And then, or I was leaning on the MTGO. Now, the MTGO is fantastic for getting feedback loops on card analysis. That I do like. Like, I don't know, the Fable of the Mirror Breaker has been a card that basically I've adopted into my cubes. But I also like the creativity of being my own thing. That's why my 540 Vintage is my least favorite from a personality standpoint, whereas I love and adore my Artifacts, my Femme Fatale, my Horror Cube, my 180 Munson Cube, etc., because they're Anthony. Yeah. They're not a replication of anything else.
So, speaking of Anthony, first of all, this beer is delicious. Second of all, that's probably the most humble I've heard you speak about the Power Cube. When you go to CubeCon and you see Anthony there, you want to play his Power Cube because it is absolutely awesome.
Appreciate that. All right. So then there's other variations. So we talked about the traditional 60 card and how it takes away, I mean, in the personal opinions, right? The math is different. But then we have like a set draft, and that introduces a whole new level of variation. You've got novice players, you have expert players, you have your store champion sitting in the same room, right? You might have, small children for the very first time being introduced to play Magic the Gathering. So it creates a whole host of variation that can damper the math. So I am curious to see what Dr. Brinkley has to say about that statement.
Agree. Totally different. I think the most interesting piece from a probability and statistical point of view of draft is in traditional, I know what's in my deck. I don't know what's in your deck. But with draft, I've seen almost all of the cards except for everybody's pick one from the pack, which means I know what's in the deck that I've built. So I have all of those probabilities in my head because it's my deck. But now in draft, what was interesting and fun about that is I have a sense of what's in your deck. And I think that's one of the places where the machines will eventually be able to beat us, is that we will not be able to retain that kind of information and make predictions as to, well, I was in the same draft as these other people, and I see that he took this, so he's playing this. And so this other person can't be playing that because there wasn't enough cards to support two drafters.
Would you say you're reading the room, less mathematical analysis, Dr. Brinkley?
No.
going back to the pilot argument.
No, not at all, because I'm not reading the players at all. I'm reading the cards. I'm reading the cards and assigning, like, if you took this white card and then I see you're playing this white card and this black card, then the only reason why you would have cards maybe that weren't in that color is that maybe you hate drafted them, or you wanted to keep them, or you didn't want your opponents to have them. So it's a smaller pool of things that you have to think about.
Interesting side topic. What are your viewpoints on hate drafting? It's something I'm not in love with. I think it detracts from your own methods unless your deck can't beat it.
Oh, no, that's exactly, like, I think that's the other place where the math gets you, is because we'll get at the intersection of this later on, but you have the player and the game. And so hate drafting, like if I'm playing something that's huge, creatures, I certainly don't want you to have something that's easy for you to cast that gets rid of a big creature. So I'd certainly want to get that out of the way. Or if you know the players, like my good friend Anthony plays a lot of aristocrats. I think we've talked about that. You've talked about this on the podcast. Yes. Yeah. So, why would I let you have something that's key to aristocrats? That happens every time. I just wanted to join the club of people that say aristocrats instead on the podcast.
Worst Disney movie ever.
Exactly. But, you play the people, you play the cards as well.
All right. So we kind of have the same concepts hold true. And again, we're a cube discussion, but I thought that's brought relevance to give layers to this. EDH is another one that creates kind of a singleton format. I think EDH, in its sense, I know it's repetitive and you have play reps because generally when someone builds a deck, they play it over and over again. It can play with a certain amount of consistency, but you do have that leverage in there, that time, opposed to drafting to try to break the variance, try to overcome the attrition. You're adding more cantrips, so you're mathematically increasing the opportunity to draw key cards. Cube, in my environments, like I said, are a singleton format, and the variance comes in for me is not only player skill level, the math, it's the deck building, the knowledge of deck building. And Dr. Brinkley is chomping at the bit to make a statement.
I am, as usual here. One of the great things about EDH, I think when it was introduced and it really caught on, it was great that Wizards embraced it. And from a marketing perspective, it was the best thing that could ever happen to them because they can
monetize it.
Well, that's right. You could have multiple cards that do the same thing with different names so that people can still build around some of those concepts. So it was a good thing that they didn't just say, oh, well, we already have a Wrath of God, so why would we make another kind of Wrath of God? Why would you have Day of Judgment? But it's really useful in the EDH environment, which makes it useful for the Cube environment so that you can have similar cards on a theme.
Yeah, that solves that singleton problem that I've created for myself. That's my own design by restriction. So when I see those type of reprints, that's a good point, right? Anything, and I do like those type of cards. But then you can actually overly saturate by trying to overly support the idea. That's a balancing game, a whole different creature. We're going to go with that when we start doing thematic cube design as an idea. But for now, mathematically, I do like iterations because it increases the chances. But argumentatively speaking, though, board wipes aren't something you're going to want in replication unless you're actually like in a Super Friends or some kind of extreme control circumstance, because you're also setting yourself back too. I get the idea, but I get the idea of iterations, though. You want more copies of it or similarities.
Well, that would also think about that in terms of, and we'll get back to this as well, but the difference between a 180, a 360, and a 540.
So the math's going to tighten.
Right, but if you think about the fact that you're only playing singletons and you're going to play a large 540 cube, then you have other math that you have to get through to make sure at least somebody gets some of those key cards.
Yeah, and so we'll get into the hypergeometric calculators and math shortly. I'm not a huge proponent of hypergeometric calculus, and here's why. Is because I think it takes away in the singleton environment, if that's what you're choosing to do to yourself, like I am. I'm doing.
When we start thinking about something like a hypergeometric calculator, that's an online calculator that you can find in a couple of different places. I think Cube Cobra has one.
It does.
Where you get probabilities of drawing cards of a specific type, given that the size of your deck decreases as you draw those cards out. So that's really what a hypergeometric distribution does, is that since you're drawing a card, that card's coming out of your library and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You want a probability calculator that compensates for the fact that you're drawing those cards. What's good about that is that, it sort of tells you the chance that some of these things will happen when you're thinking about design. But it has some limitations, right, Anthony?
Yeah, your sample size is shrinking. And so you're pulling from a smaller pool. So you're increasing the odds of pulling the card, and then you can calculate it. But my particular problem with using it to singleton curate is that you can put in iterations of cards that are simply weaker, trying to overly develop a particular archetype. And we'll use Reanimator as the victim here. So generally speaking, I won't go past 3 mana value on any recovery target, any Reanimator target. There are four CMC or 4 mana value targets out there, like I used Zombify before. But then they start getting so far off kilter. How much do you want to spend to bring the thing back? Is your target even a viable target that you want to bring it back? If it costs 6, so we'll use Grave Titan. It costs 6. I don't want to pay 5 to bring back 6.
Yeah.
Even though it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a last-ditch effort. That's not a real Reanimator target. Yeah. What I want to play is 1 or 2 to bring back 6, so I'm jumping the mana curve. Whenever you start going into the hypergeometric math, you start using that to drive your card choices so that you overly saturate your environment trying to support an archetype. You start putting in bad cards. Yeah. Those bad cards now fall subject to the human element, because as a drafter, I'm not going to take a Zombify unless I'm a super desperate drafter. And by then, I'm pushing an archetype so hard, it's uncomfortable. So I'm choosing bad elements. So 23 pick. So it starts moving so fast, right?
Yeah, totally agree. Agree with all of that. I would say, in addition, 2 more things. The hypergeometric calculator, as you said, it's the cards off the stack there and the issues there. But it also, when you start thinking about converted mana costs, it doesn't. It would be not all 3 casting cost things are the same. 3 colorless versus 3 black. The hypergeometric calculator is not worrying about the complexity of some of that stuff. And it also doesn't really account for the fact that you're playing an opponent who is doing other stuff as well. So, there's a lot more interaction that those sort of simple calculators just aren't capturing all of the math in the environment versus these like AI, machine learning, computer algorithm driven pieces that are doing stuff that's way more complex.
Yeah, the machine that's playing, the hypergeometric is designing.
Exactly.
It's a whole different creature, 2 subsets, right?
Exactly.
Like I said before, my preference is a curator. I don't like to put in low tier components just to overly supplement an archetype because the math tells me to. A bad is bad. I'll just say it, right?
Yeah.
And you learn that from feedback loops. That's moving the machine concept, going back to the human aspect. I get stories told back to me, i.e., Jason has mentioned to me on multiple occasions the werewolves within my horror cube is his least favorite because it's been inconsistent. I've worked on that consistently, and I keep trying to develop them and propping them up. but it's based on feedback loops, not based on machine learning. It's the human element. It's the cards just have a greater chance of losing in the horde cube. I can't help that.
I don't know that a feedback loop is anything but using data to can reconfigure the math, taking things out, putting things in. I would also say that, the werewolves are still weak. The werewolves are still weak, but I kind of play around that too, because green's one of my favorite, colors to draft, and that's where a lot of those werewolves are at.
So let's talk about some of the math tools you have that are available to you. Cube Cobra is an amazing database. If you aren't using it, I highly recommend you hop on there. That's where I keep all my cubes at. I love it. And I have two things that I like the most, and it's the averages. I use the averages function, so I can go into my cube, and I'll include this in the show notes. You'll be able to see it. It'll basically show me what my percentages of by color pie and give me an idea, and it'll show me the medium and the standard deviation. It gives me counts, etc. I just get a lot of knowledge out there to make sure I'm pseudo balancing. And then there's one that I like even more. It's the table function. And the table function actually breaks it down by card type. And then I can see the percentages by color wheel and card type. And on a 540, in this case, I did my power cube. It breaks it down all the way down to the 100%. And I can make sure that I'm not overly saturating an idea. And like if I got an artifact cube or artifact.deck within my power cube, I can then look at this and use this as a means to see if I have enough artifacts in there to support the concept, even outside of the traditional archetype build.
So coming back to the show notes, you have the two tables here, and there's one of the first tables that's in the show notes is this table of averages, where you said you got the average and you've got a standard deviation. I just want to have my stats 101 classic moment for a second for that. The table for which cube is this?
This is the power cube.
Power cube. So Anthony's got the table broken down by all 5 colors and colorless. And the average for all of them is, fluctuates between like 2.6 to like 3.3. So just about on average across the colors, you got balance. And on average, the converted mana cost of the cards in those colors is about 3. But it's not that one that actually fascinates me about the power cube. It's the standard deviation column, which measures spread. And so for most of those colors, his standard deviation is about a 1.4 or 1.5, something like that. But his colorless standard deviation is more than double at 3.3. And what that tells people when they're looking at stuff is that the colorless, the artifacts that are in his power cube really are... Well, some of them are lands, but it's a power cube, right? But it's also a dichotomy. It's really split. You've got a lot of 0, 1s, and 2s, and you've got a lot of 6, 7s, and 8s, or 5, 6s, and 7s, so that they average out. And that really tells you a lot when you start thinking about the design of your cube.
It does.
Because when you're looking at those standard deviations, the bigger they are, the more spread out the cards are in that color or that group. So for colorless, I would say it was great. But if that standard deviation for black had been 3 when everything else was like 1.5, that should tell the curator that their mana curve is way off for that color.
Yeah, like if you were sporting a white weenie deck, what he's saying, and you had a spread that was greater than 3, then you've got a significant deviation. You want to see a tighter pattern if you're sporting a white weenie deck in your mono white section. So that's kind of where that gradient comes in from. That's why I brought Dr. Brinkley.
So, turning to the other table, I think this is extremely fascinating, where the other table that he has it broken down by color as columns, and then the rows are different types of cards: creature, planeswalker, instance, artifacts, things like that. And you look at that table and they have counts as to how many cards in the cube are at the intersection of those things. So, for example, his power cube has 40 white creatures, and it has 22 multicolored creatures, and it has 23 colorless lands. So it gives you a sense as to how much balance there is in the cube across creature types and across colors, so that you can kind of make a sense of, what those lines of play will potentially be.
So what it does offer to the curator using this, look, I talked about it before. I have a skeleton of design that I use as a footprint, right? And I kind of already know how many lands percentage-wise. I talked about this before. Without overly using all of these metrics, whenever I'm doing or analytics, I'm using basically like a thumbprint design. I want to start out with 10% removal, 10 to 15% removal, give or take plus or minus 3, actually 15% plus or minus 3% deviation on that. And then I'll use a 10% for my land count plus or minus 2%, depending on the variation of what I have in the cube. And then creature count, depending on what the thematic is, it plays into it. Do I want it to be creature dense, not creature dense, et cetera, et cetera. So I wire work this before I even started. But if I started theory crafting this and generating this on Cube Cobra before I spent a dime, I could build this, and then I could use these tables that we're going to share with you in the show notes that Dr. Brinkley was talking about, that you could see all of your gradients. You can see your standard deviations. And you can look to see if, and it's 40,000 feet in the air. It's neat. Before you've even pulled the trigger and went and met your first, play group and started, getting criticism from the human aspect, you can get the math aspect. It shows all the percentages and all that. And you can see, well, maybe I'm overly supporting sorceries and I need to, and before I even go there, I know they're going to tell me I need to speed it up and do more instant speed removal. I kind of already had a gut feeling of that, but now I can see that I'm hitting about 10% sorceries and maybe 4% instants, right? And maybe you want to flip-flop the speed of the cube, and that directly impacts the speed of the environment.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, this is a great table to look at. It's like one of a couple of the great features on Cube Cobra. I would say the other one is the sort of the simulation feature,
right,
which is also all data. And I think we're going to get into some of all that in just a few minutes in terms of stuff. But that, I think, is a great lead-in thinking about what we see in the tables versus some of those other great options that the Cube aficionados can have in their cubes in Cube Cobra.
All right, so Math and Cube has two perspectives. And I'm going to take the first part. It's going to have the player perspective, and you have to think about three things. And you know who didn't think about those? Me. It was Dr. Brinkley. Go ahead.
So I would say, the three perspectives on this is sort of my play style. So, hi, I'm Jason. My pronouns are he and him, and my magic interests are usually two color combinations of either red, white, or green. I rarely play blue control today, as I played that combination in 60-card Magic from 1993 to 1999. Are you sure you're not Chinook?
Oh, no, that was very Chinook.
That was very, yeah. But that's me. That's who I am. That's what I like to play. But then what happens if I play with the same group? They get to know my play style as I get to know their play style. I just mentioned earlier that Anthony's a big fan of aristocrats. So I don't pass him a blood artist if I see it. If it's wheeled, and he's already passed it, then, I got to think about some of that. But like if he's sitting beside me, even if he's not going to play, he's going to take it maybe just in case he gets enough of it to actually roll things out. I don't really want to give him the cards that I know that he is best at. So I will hate draft in maybe a situation like that. So that's sort of a second perspective is I'm playing about me, who I am. I'm playing my game, but I need to understand my opponent's game as well. And then the third thing is, the math around the perspective of the available cards. And I think that this is a big deal on stuff, right? So it's the available cards. You have a cube curator who has specifically curated the cube for a specific experience, which means your options are not unlimited. And beyond that, there's an element of randomness that we have when we set up the packs for these things. Even the cube curator can't get over the fact that they don't get to design exactly how the packs are made.
I would 100% agree with that statement. I'll give you the cube curator perspective. And, these are things, whatever I'm designing. How big is my cube? 360, 540, etc. What archetypes am I trying to support? How big is my normal play group? We talked about this in the previous episode, and we're going to do the cube essentials. You just got to have to hone the math in there. It's going to take player repetition. I think I'm literally leaning on the pilot, not the plane. I can't let it go because I think part of this game is the gut. Because I introduce bluffs. I'm cheeky. I'm a cheeky player. Now that I've said that, I've taken away the cheekiness, right? But what I mean is I'll sit there and keep my finger on a card. I'm the element of surprise. I'll hold the extra cards in my hand that do absolutely nothing just to deter the swing. So it takes away from the math. So if your calculus is involving my behavior, my function, I become the unpredictable element in that, does that make sense?
Yes, but I think you think your group doesn't think that we know that you know. It's one of those, that Friends episode?
Yes.
It's not that you know, it's that do you know that we know that you know?
And then you just totally mess with them and you play into what they think they know. Because, yeah.
Yeah. What was the chance of all of that happening? So sort of back to the cube curator perspective. I want to jump in on something with the cube curator perspective.
Sure.
This is where some of the curation and the math sort of comes into play and it interacts. So, if you design a 540 cube, or let's just go back up to 360. So if you build a 360 cube, if you play traditional style of 3 packs of 15 cards or 45 cards total, then your 360 cube completely doled out will support 8 players. And so when you design the cube, I would assume that a cube curator's perspective is, how would this play in an 8-player setting? But you would also then have to think about, well, how would this play in a 4-player setting? Half the players, you only see half the cube. So then you start thinking about the number of themes that you can put in. You start thinking about how often some of those cards are going to see. How many duplicates do I have to support a particular archetype? All of those things from that sort of cube curator perspective is all the sort of cube curator math. So then, if I need 20% of my entire cube to be mana support, but then I sit down with 4 players and I only get, I'm going to have variations in that because I'm only playing half the cube. So you might only see 10%. You may see as much as 30%. And it's those wild swings that can impact the drafting and the play experience.
And I would also say that that's where the feedback comes in important, because you can't take a single sample size and take a bad experience, bad draft. This card blew me out. We had a recent example in my artifact cube just last night. When Bane of Progress entered the battlefield, it just totally wiped the board of another player, and their immediate response was an emotional response. This card doesn't belong in this environment, even though I meticulously curated it because I knew that once it did the thing, it's not. It's literally a vanilla card. So it has the ability to end the game, but it's not Shatterstorm. So me as a curator, I've made a decision to put a creature in that can end the game, but not just stagnate the game by blowing up all the artifacts, swinging the tide, but then doing nothing. Bane of Progress does the best of both worlds in the artifact environment. It's just an example of the feedback loop that you get from the. All right, so you've definitely seen the deviation between our two viewpoints. You've got Dr. Brinkley, we're going to call him AKA Chinook. I think that's going to be his call sign going forward. Checker breaker out. And then you've got Uber Bear. So our two teams. So I am all about the pilot versus the machine. He's all about the machine versus the pilot. Two different aspects, but I'm going to give him one more time in his ring. He has some particular subject matter he'd like to cover to fortify his stance.
I would think let's talk through the cube design through to the cube play experience.
Well, as we do that, here comes the pilot. Carry on, Keebler.
So, we talked about the different perspectives. So let's think about this as the cube curator. You're building a new cube and you're doing all of these things, right? So we've already talked about the hypergeometric distribution and sort of thinking about a design stage. Like, how much of these different things should you be putting in the cube? I would contend that you have to go beyond what you put into the system and those analytics that you see online in the design process. The statistics should be getting way deeper for you at the design stage. So let's just start off. You have the basic thinking about that color distribution. And you sort of think, okay, well, I've got a 360 cube and I want a certain balance. So then I'm going to have, it's not going to be 20% all the way down. I think when you go to Cube Cobra and you look at stuff, you see that the color list is way larger. So you say, okay, I'm going to have 35% colorless. So then everything else, then you sort of try to break it up to be even and be balanced. But what does it mean to be balanced? That's where you start really getting into it as sort of a cube curator. Balance means what's the playability, right? So then you have the data that you're collecting and the math you should be doing should be way more complex. You should be thinking about the intersection of those things. It's not just about how many creatures you have. It's about the proportion of creatures that you have that are ramp versus proportion of creatures that are game winning. As a cube curator, the proportion of the creatures and large elements that are game finishers, right? You and Stu talk about this. Somebody asked the
So you're referring to utilitarian versus win con, right?
Yep.
And that does create a whole different viewpoint. Like, how many haymakers do you want versus how many buildups to said haymakers? That makes sense. That makes sense.
So, but the math gets so much more complex than that. Like, as a cube curator, if you go too far into utilitarian, then people are ramping up to something that they have too much mana for, and it's just sitting around and it's not getting there. By contrast, if you have too much board wipes, if you have too much big finishers, then the games just stall until somebody can place their big finisher. And by then, you've had, a dozen boring rounds.
Yeah, we talked about that armies must march. So the math can actually impede the armies marching. That comes back to my framework that I use with the balancing of removal spells, which we did a whole suite on removal and discussing what removal means to Anthony and Stu, but it actually stops the armies from marching. Counterspells fall within that realm as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's a great point in terms of thinking about probabilities and really trying to dig deeper in terms of stuff. you as a player perspective, and then as a cube designer thinking about how the players are going to play. It's the same perspective for the cube curator. He or she has to think about all those things. But, when you play a card, a lot of times when we think of probabilities, we're thinking about probability that's going to be countered. And you say, well, I'm not playing somebody that's blue. So then the probability that's going to be countered is almost nil. Right. So then some of it's contingent on other aspects of the build when you're thinking about that from a cube curator perspective. Right.
Whereas I'm using a sociological predictive model based on what I know about my players. I'm back to Team Pilot.
Yeah. But even with Team Pilot, then as a cube curator, you have to decide that if you're playing blue, you got to have enough counter magic. So I got to go get some of these different counter clones for all those different things. How many of those do I need to actually make some of this work? And then those probabilities get way deeper. And then what most cube curators were going to get when they move from that like basic math to more complex math is that play style, right? So then you have to think about the fact that all of the choices that you're making at the intersection of all of those things are also contingent on the number of players you're going to have. And then that's a part of your play group. Does your play group normally play all 8 players? And you're normally only going to play this cube when you have 8 people to do it. I think that's probably the case with Anthony's 2-headed giant cube.
Yeah, that's why I never get to play the damn thing. What you're referring to, so how do we simulate these ideas? How do we do any predictive model? If I've got that anxiety, it's Friday night, I just built this brand new La Femme Fatale. I want the people to like it. I want them to like it. Yeah. How do I predictively model it? How do I simulate it before I even get there?
Yeah, so now that's like, what do you do? So you do all of these choices. I would say, first of all, you should do multiple things. But one thing is, Cube Cobra lets you, once you put in those decks, you get to download them. And just download them. You don't have to be like a super experienced PhD math nerd. Put it into Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel has a ton of great tools that you can use to sort of play around with some of this stuff. So like we took Anthony's Power Cube that he knows a whole lot about, that we've got the tables and the show notes on there, things that he knew about some of that. So then we sat down and we started looking at it. I downloaded that Cube Cobra, just threw it into Excel and started playing around with it. I would say that as somebody trying to apply more math to it, that's your first start. You've curated this cube, you've put it together, you put it online, then you want to download it and play with your own data so that you know your cube, right? So that you are then the expert. So then you have sort of put pen to paper on what those lines of play are. And then you can sort of put down like the probabilities more specifically when you start thinking about it, like, well, what is the chance that I see this particular set of cards? What is the chance that I get some of these things? And then if you download it to something like Excel and start playing around with it, what we found in Anthony's Power Cube was that there was actually more humans, because it's not really a tribal sort of cube, it's power. So there was no reason to explore sort of like tribal affinities in all of it. So then we sat down, we just took that data and we started looking at it. We found that, how big is that cube? 360?
540.
540. We found 55 humans in the cube. 10% of the cube is humans. So while that's not super important to begin with, it does create the potential for a line of play that the cube curator may not have foreseen in advance.
I think he actually branched out the analytics even more by card type. So he went clerics, he went by artificers, and he started doing basically the cloud breakdown of each one of them. And then it was interesting to see the analytics proposed forward.
Yeah. And I will tell you the other great thing with that you would be able to get when you download some of those is you can then re-upload some of those pieces of information to like online word cloud makers. And so then you can get like word clouds of like creature types. And I think that's some of what we were doing when we were exploring some of that. So that then we could look and sort of see, well, what are those creature types when there's so many of them and they're too hard to categorize, and you can sort of do some of those different things with it. But, there's other synergies that you can start looking at when you look at it. You've got a lot of multicolor decks, and you need to start thinking about how are my multicolor cards being played. So I would say all of that is sort of a first level. So let's take one more level real quick on this. And you sort of think about, as the cube curator, you've got play, you've got draft, and you've got play experience, right? You want a good draft experience, which means you're doing a lot of math and calculations in terms of what I think the experience is going to be for my folks. And some of that's going to be, is this cube 8 players and meant to be 8 players? Or is it 8 players max and we can play 4 to 8, 4, 6, and 8? And what do those look like? And, things of that sort. You think about, your play group. How sophisticated are they? Do they like sophisticated lines of play? Are there certain things that they absolutely hate? Does your play group hate land destruction? Then if you're playing Armageddon, then what may happen is that your play group only hate drafts it, which means it never enters the lines of play that you want for the group. So Luke Skywalker has shot at the Darth Vader at Darth Vader. Luke Skywalker
he did technically shoot Darth
Luke
Vader.
Skywalker shot at the Death Star again and whiffed
with a laser beam. All right, so
and there was one final line of play, and one final line of play is the actual play of it, right? So then you're playing that play experience out, So how are you? I don't know. I think that's probably the hardest part for a cube curator. So how would you think, Anthony, the lines of play in terms of the play experience? Like, what are you thinking about in terms of the kind of math you think your players are doing while they're... I'll flip that one to you.
Some players, so we've got players in our group that are highly skilled modern players. They play at higher tiers, higher levels. They do have their skill set. There is skill set involved, right? But I try not to take too much credence into it. My feedback loop that I generally get, going back to the werewolves conversation where Jason specifically thinks they're weak, I can put them in the hands of, say, Christian Anderson, who was on the a previous show, and he can run wild with them. So I think it's all about piloting. I'm still really leaning on the pilot, and I'm more of a thumb in the wind. Math has a certain amount of skill or a certain amount of participation in this idea, whereas the human aspect, the human element, really plays a key element here. I'm going to start working on, would you like to work on some machine learning together? I can write the code, you write the concepts. I'm a coder.
Yeah. Well, we should think about that, definitely. I would say, kicking back to you about the play style, this is where you and I are in agreement that from the cube curator perspective, how you're examining and predicting the human element of it actually being played out is probably the least mathematical portion of all of this. And so I certainly would give credence to that piece right there. I think that there is also good opportunities. We took what we did with your cube example and sort of downloaded some of that. I think there's some opportunities here to take a whole large swath of cubes in different realms and do some of this sort of statistical analysis on stuff. I think that's something that we could do and maybe experiment with. It might be worthwhile asking the community what kind of things that they would like to see looked into as some of that project. Maybe we'll come back and do some of that.
I will share within the show notes these tables and stuff. This is all embedded within Cube Cobra and the suite of tools they have, which is actually spectacular. So final thoughts. Do we dismiss the math and go with experience, or is there an even blend? I got a psst from Jason just now. Is there an even keel on that? Is the human element take a role in the decision making, both on the curation in addition to the play style and reading the table? Is the poker player outpilot the poker deck? All right. Are we just bound to Chinook to beat us eventually in checkers? I mean, being the greatest player for 40 years to get taken down by a machine in 1992 must have been very humbling, but says a lot about the development of machines, right? When it comes down to the artistic design and curation of a cube, opposed to the mathematical design, or is there an even keel blend to these two concepts? As far as trial and error, and that's the repetition, that's our form of simulation. And our simulation group, our group that we're gaining feedback from, it is confined to our play group. For example, when I go to KubeCon, I'm going to get a wild array of data. Like I'm hoping they provide an extensive amount of feedback, and it may be positive. Constructive criticism would be ideal, right? So that I can tweak and gain. But I'm going to have a lot of players that don't fall within the spectrum that I'm traditionally used to playing in front of.
Yeah.
I can't game their play styles. My poker stuff's going to go out the wind, because what we talked about when Christian Anderson and I did the poker episode, we talked about reading the table and losing a few hands so you could gain the math advantage on the behavioral aspects of the player so you could play into their skill sets and tells.
Yeah.
Whereas we're going to go into a fresh set of table, 120-something players across the queue. That's a lot of sample size.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to the data metrics that are going to be provided from that, and what cards are provided certain archetype benefits, which ones were which were a detriment, right?
Yeah. I think thinking about things like that, thinking about data that's on Cube Cobra, I think there's great opportunity to do some of this further. I think if the community's hungry for stuff like that, then we should come back with specifics. We should come back with actual data and actual results and actual things. Let's actually do some of the math. We've talked about big picture, in terms of stuff. And I think where we should, if you'd like to have me back, I would love to come back and get very specific on some of that. Maybe we'll get some good data from KubeCon. Maybe you'll get some good data off Cube Cobra, and we can go from there.
100%. I think the analytics only do anything but to prove that the pilot's just better than the machine. But
Let's see.
All right. Well, that's pretty much it. I'm going to move over to the socials. I appreciate Dr. Brinkley joining us for this particular episode. I'll have him on a future episode. Good friend of ours, Jason, Dr. Brinkley. We're doing the formalities today. He's just been a spectacular guest. If you guys want to hear more from that, I certainly hope so. We're going to dive into it. Other than that, Stu, myself, and Christian will be at KubeCon October the 20th to the 23rd, Madison, Wisconsin. And if you love the show, and we certainly, truly, hope you do, please give us a 5-star review on your favorite player. You can find us on Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod and reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com, or you can link us on Discord at UberCube. Otherwise, you can find us on Patreon /UberCube. Other than that, this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you, Jason, for joining us.
Thank you.
This is wonderful, and we're happy cubing.